Okay, now it's recording for you as well.
Okay.
Because the connection is lagging actually a lot. So, okay, you guys, the connection is lagging a little bit from our side. So we are recording the session and the teachings and everything. So when we upload the video afterwards, that video will have no lag. So you can, if you missed something and if a word got lost in the with the lag, then you can revisit the video again in the Google Drive. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So we were talking about what we talked about yesterday. So we went through the life of the Buddha, the 4 sights that he saw. The 4th one was a spiritual wanderer, someone who was trying to find a liberation through his own or personal experience. And so he decided that that was how he wanted his life to go. And he practiced meditation for a long time, and he practiced ascetic ways of practicing, you know, by denying the body. And then he finally decided that he was going to figure it out on his own, and then became enlightened that way. And then he taught for about 40 years. Then we talked about his first teaching, which was in Deer Park, which is near Sarnath in northern India. And let's see. Oh, I have to do that. Okay. And his first teaching was the 4 Noble Truths. Okay, so there they are again. The truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, the truth of cessation, and the truth of the path. So we talked yesterday about suffering, and we talked about 3 different types of suffering. Suffering of suffering, which is what we usually think of, discomfort or pain, of both emotional and physical pain. And then also the fact that often when we have painful or difficult situations, that we get upset because we are suffering. In addition to having a sickness, then we get upset that we're sick. So this is the suffering of suffering. The suffering of change is when things that we usually think make us happy aren't actually suffering because they change. They are impermanent, meaning that someday everything that is the product of causes and conditions will end. So even if it's something like, well, we talked about the example of cheesecake. And if cheesecake were really the source of happiness, then the more that we ate it, the happier we would be. And that just isn't the case, okay? And so anything that if we rely on it for lasting or ultimate happiness, if it comes from the senses and is external, it will fail us. It will end. You know, coming together always ends in coming apart. The seeds of something coming into being are also the seeds of its ending. So this disappointment, this loss that we can feel if we rely on things, if we get attached to things that we think are going to give us ultimate happiness. And then all pervasive suffering, which is the things that the Buddha talked about in terms of this aging, sickness, and death that we are all faced with, and that we have no ability to control. We can't stop them. They're just things that happen to us out of our control. Okay. And then the second one, the truth of the cause, it talks about the fact that within our minds is an ignorance, which is a misperception of reality. And we gave the example of how we often, because things look like they're going to stay the same, you know, because we have one experience of cheesecake, you know, making us happy, giving us pleasure. We think that every single time we eat cheesecake, it's going to make us happy. And that isn't necessarily true, because as we learned, the more we eat cheesecake, the more unhappy we will be. And sometimes we even end up chasing experiences that made us happy, thinking we can recreate them. But the fact is that they've changed. And so our misperception of reality is this belief that things are staying the same. Okay, that's one aspect of it. So, and these misperceptions, this belief that this thing that is going to make me happy, and is because it gave me good feelings now, I believe it gave me good feelings, and I believe that it's going to stay the same, then that's when I get into things like greed or afflictive emotions, or I believe that the person who harms me is the source of my hurt, even though their harm may have lasted, for a short time and was a long time ago. We oftentimes will just hold on to it, right? We hold on to our feelings of anger because we had the feeling of hurt. Now we believe this person is still hurting us, even though it was in the past. Okay, and that person has changed, and we have changed. And afflictive emotions then are a lead to suffering. So this is the second noble truth. And there's a lot more that we'll go into in terms of the truth of the cause, because like we said yesterday, if we want to cure our suffering, then we have to figure out what the cause is of that dissatisfaction, of that difficulty, of that pain, and try to get rid of it. Okay. And then the third noble truth is the truth of cessation. So cessation means stopping the cause. Okay, that's what cessation means. And this is the hopeful aspect of Buddhism, this idea that habits can be changed, that our minds can actually start to shift how they perceive things, so that our response to difficult situations in our life is not so difficult, right? We don't have to necessarily react to every trigger that happens to us. We can actually start to be happy, even if external situations are a little difficult. And I think it was this class we talked about yesterday. We can even start to see that these, uncomfortable situations are actually the source of us learning to be happier. Like, for example, when I'm challenged by someone in my environment, like say they irritate me, they do something that I really don't like, instead of seeing it as this, really difficult situation, and maybe I can't get away from them, and maybe, they're really making my life miserable, I see it that way. Instead, seeing it as an opportunity for me to work on my mind, to develop patience in the face of difficulty, to actually learn to be kind to that person, even though in the face of irritation. And what that does is that strengthens my mind. Okay, so this hopefulness, this idea that those afflictive emotions, those difficult emotions can actually be removed, and that our mental habits that create so much suffering for us can be changed. Okay. And then the truth of the path, I'll get better at this. You may know as the Eightfold Noble Path if you studied any kind of Theravada traditions, like out of Thailand or Burma or Sri Lanka. Sometimes I think insight meditation, Goenkaji trained in Burma. So some of the Eightfold Noble Path, and we can actually take those 8 paths, like right livelihood, right ethics, right concentration, right view, all those, and we can divide it into 3, bringing it, kind of clump it into 3. And the first one is ethics, or not harming, which actually creates a lot of really positive things in our lives, because if we aren't harming others, if we are being kind to others and responding not with retaliation when they harm us, with kindness, then actually we create a lot of the conditions for ourselves to be very, for them to be kind to us. It's kind of an amazing process, but it's true. So just developing ethics can be really positive for our own lives. And then concentration, ethics also, another thing that ethics does is it gets rid of all the guilt and the disturbing emotions that are related to when we harm others in whatever way. And so then your concentration becomes even better. You can concentrate more easily. go. By practicing ethics, your mind it's easier to calm and still the mind. And this is the training of the mind. And then the wisdom aspect is seeing things as they really are. And we gave this example of impermanence. And I talked about the iPhone yesterday, that if we really had the view of that our phones are going to become obsolete and they're going to break eventually, when they do, that decreases a lot of the disappointment. It's like, oh, well, it was going to happen anyway, and I knew it was going to happen, so now I'm ready for it, okay? So this is one way in which we can start to train the mind to see things more clearly as they really are. And this also has to do with ourselves. When we start looking at this, you may have heard of this concept in Buddhism of selflessness, which we'll have to go into more deeply, because it doesn't mean that you don't exist. It doesn't mean that you don't have a self. It actually means that certain ways of viewing the self do not exist. And we tend to interact with our own identities with this sense of me in a way that is kind of make-believe or hallucination. We think we're much more important than we actually are. We think that we're much more solid and concrete, that there's a self here that is so unchangeable, that is so absolute. And Buddhism brings this insight to the fact that this kind of self doesn't really exist, which releases us in so many ways and allows us to be so much more flexible with ourselves, kind in the world. It allows us to try new things, to break out of old habits. So this whole, oftentimes when we get this core identity and we associate it with certain characteristics, it really can hold us back. So this idea in Buddhism of a selflessness can be very freeing and very helpful when it comes to relieving some of that emotional, in particular, suffering. Okay, so that's the Four Noble Truths. Quick introduction. So we'll be coming back to each one of them further in the class. But now I'd like to talk about this focus of the mind. So the mind in particular is where Buddhists have really put their attention, pun intended. So you know, in the West, in the Western world, in you know, Europe and many countries, there has been, like in the last 1,000 years or so, a lot of development in terms of technology and the external world. Like we're very good at you know, science in terms of, you know, what's going on with our Earth, and even, you know, at subatomic levels, and it's very amazing. But this idea of studying the mind hasn't been so much in the forefront for Western psychology, because this scientific method has a lot to do with having hypothesis and then experimenting on those, and then also being able to repeat those experiments and verify them, you know, with you know, your peers have to be able to repeat your experiments in order to say, yes, this is how things really are. But when we start talking about the mind, it's very hard to study in that way because we can't measure it. It doesn't exist as a physical entity, okay? It is subjective, naturally, because that's what subjective means, is that that we, you know, it's our own. But in India and in Tibet, they actually spent their time focusing and developing a very technical language for different states of mind, for ways in which the mind functions. And this has allowed them to now communicate on very deep levels about meditative states and develop techniques about how to work with the mind. That, and their way of validating it was through the discussion, through their debate, through talking about it, through having similar mental experiences, and then developing a language around that. And the whole tradition that we have of, you know, passing down the teachings from teacher to student to teacher, you know, who becomes the teacher, who becomes the student, you know, and so on and so forth, is this, my teacher called it from warm hand to warm hand, that there were these, you know, close relationships that would guide students on these specific meditative techniques and ways to work with the mind, that were very highly developed and now are very refined and have been very refined in Tibet. Tibet didn't have a lot of technology until more recently. They were not particularly developed in that area because their focus was really on developing their minds, you know, their spiritual growth, they called it. So let's look at some of the aspects, some of the characteristics of the mind. Okay. This isn't the slide I want. Where's my slide? Oh, darn. It's not on here anymore. Nope. Oh, maybe here. There we go. Okay. So one aspect of the mind that I already started to talk about is its non-physical nature. So it cannot be seen. You cannot measure it. If you look for the mind, you cannot find it. It doesn't have boundaries. It doesn't have edges. It doesn't have a color. It doesn't have a shape. And yet we know it exists. And the reason why we know it exists is because we can use it. We can experience it. Like when I talked about yesterday about imagining an apple. You can imagine an apple in your mind, which is not present. I mean, I'm not seeing an apple right now, and yet I can imagine an apple in my mind. So I know that there is something that is functioning, that is actually there, okay? And so that, but it's not physical. So it's present, it exists, but it's not physical. The second thing is that it is clear like a mirror in the sense of it can reflect things. So the things that I see with my senses, hear, taste, touch, these things, that they can be reflected in my mind. And so that shows that the mind isn't filled with stuff, right, that block that. Okay, so it is clear in that sense, clear like a mirror. Now, then we have to look at the images that we bring into our mind. Are they actually as accurate as we believe? Like the image that I am creating in my mind of an apple, is that the same as an actual apple that I might be looking at? Okay, and one thing we know is that no, it's not, because an actual apple is constantly changing. You know, it's rotting, it's interacting with the air in the, you know, in the water, in the elements, and it is actually changing. But my image of an apple actually stays the same. It continues to look exactly like, and it's usually something like, you know, like my ideal of an apple. Okay, so that's something else to look at. Although it's clear and reflect things, we have to look at, are those reflections accurate? Okay, am what I'm thinking of in my mind actually what my senses are experiencing? Okay, the third aspect of the mind is its knowing nature. So the fact that I can, the mirror of my mind is not the same as a regular mirror, in the sense that a mirror doesn't know it's looking at an apple. Okay, it can't have an experience, a consciousness of an apple. Okay, it can only reflect it, you know, very, you know, it's just the light and the colors. It doesn't have an actual experience of knowing and discriminating and say, you know, if you hold up an orange, it doesn't know, oh, now there's an orange that I'm reflecting. Okay, but the mind does have that capacity, and sometimes they call this luminosity, which is luminosity in the sense of light, bringing light to objects, whether they're objects of the senses or objects in the mind, that they bring light to it in that sense that when they bring a light to it, when you shine a light on something, you can see it more clearly. You can know more clearly what it is if you bring light to it. So this idea of luminosity is also this sense of the mind's ability to know. The next thing characteristic of the mind is that it changes from moment to moment. It is constantly changing all the time. And you have likely experienced this in your meditation. If you sit down and just watch your mind for a while, so many things come up, you know, up and down, up and down. You're thinking about, you know, your mom, then you're thinking about your friend, and then you're thinking about what you're going to do next week, and then you're thinking about, you know, your apple, and then you're planning what you're going to do. And, you know, this constant movement of the mind is changing. And so it's moment to moment change, but you can also know that the mind is changing because if you can imagine or remember, some of us can remember what our minds were like when we were 5 years old and we didn't have this huge, you know, vocabulary that we have now. And we didn't know things like, you know, how to do, you know, long division or something in mathematics. You know, in so many ways, our minds as a 5-year-old were much simpler than they are now. Our minds now have all this, you know, memories and experiences that have happened, and yet our minds of being 5 years old and now are connected. They're connected in some way, actually causally, in the sense that our minds in our past moments cause our future moment of minds. So right now, or let's say before I came to this class, I have an experience with the monkeys where they're being a little threatening because they have some food and they think I have food, and so they want to kind of run after me. Now, the more I have threatening experiences with monkeys, then now when I see a monkey, I'm more likely to feel, you know, threatened, even though they're like, you know, across the lawn and they're not even looking at me, you know, they have nothing to do with me. But my mind has been conditioned, hasn't it, by my experiences. So this is another example of how the mind of now that is more responsive, you know, more reactive, I would say, to monkeys, is the result of a previous mind and having negative experiences with monkeys, right? So that's where we see this cause of a past mind affecting a present mind. Okay, and of course the mind is not a single lump. It's not just a single thing. That it's got lots of different functions. It's got memory, it's got discrimination like intelligence, it's got all sorts of feelings, it's got all these concepts in it, you know, with love and compassion and jealousy and all these things. And it also has levels in the sense of it's got a most obvious like a waking level, and then it has levels of where it is less available to us. So sometimes we talk about that as being more subconscious. And then it has a dreaming function. So when we're asleep, our mind is still active, but we aren't necessarily aware of it unless we're aware when we're dreaming. Okay. And then it's also the source of our happiness. And we talked about this a little bit yesterday, but the example that I like to use is that if external things, you know, if we can make that distinction, and that's iffy, you know, of somehow there's an objective out there world that is separate from my mind. But if we believe that our external circumstances, everything going on, you know, around us, the food we eat and the you know, the people we interact with and, you know, where we're living, if that was the source of our happiness, then the more and more comfortable we were, the more we had everything that we wanted, the more our circumstances were very perfect, the happier we would be, right? But in fact, that isn't necessarily true, because we see that there are people who have very, you know, what looks like very perfect circumstances, external circumstances, that are not necessarily happy. they have a lot of you know, problems with depression and suicide and things like that. And we see that there are people in this world who have very little. They, you know, they live in you know, not very nice houses. Maybe they have some sickness in their lives, you know, some problems, difficulties, and yet they have happiness. So if it were only dependent on external circumstances, then all the people who, you know, the low income people in the world would be all depressed. And it just, that's not the way it is. The truth is that we actually see a higher suicide rate in more affluent countries. So so looking at, okay, so then if it's not all, I mean, it's related to our external circumstances, but it's not really dependent on them. It's more dependent on our view, our perception, how we see our circumstances. And luckily, that's something we can work with. That's something that we can train. Okay. So let's look a little bit more about some more characteristics of the Buddha's, I think there was a quick way to do this, of the mind according to the Buddhist point of view. Oh, it's back. Okay. So another aspect of the mind is the fact that we talked about the mind being a continuum, and we talk about it in terms of being like a mind stream. Okay, sometimes we call it a mind stream. So these moments of mind that we talked about that are continuous, you know, constantly changing. This moment of mind, because it becomes the moment of, you know, the cause for the next moment of mind. And we've got all these layers, you know, we've got all this going on, and it's really hard to describe because we have to use like physical examples of something that is non-physical, because it's really hard to talk about something that is non-physical without using this idea of like a river, you know, that is moving along and constantly changing. So a mind stream. And then we have this idea of a beginningless continuum. So the idea that the mind does not have a beginning. Now I'm using the words mind and awareness and consciousness all as synonyms. So for me, they all mean the same thing, okay? Mind and consciousness and awareness all meaning the same thing. So a beginningless continuum means that that it did not have a beginning. So therefore, it was not created by, for example, a theistic God. Okay, there was no moment in which it did not exist and then it came into being. Okay, so Buddhism is considered a non-theistic religion. Okay, so no creator God in here. Okay, with this system. Actually, consciousness has always existed. And so then we start to talk about, well, okay, then the second one. So the mind then is not the same as the brain, but it is interconnected with it, in the sense that many neurologists, scientists still have this view that the mind is somehow an emergent property of the brain, that we don't know how yet, but eventually we will figure out how all the, you know, the neurotransmitters, those chemicals that are between the cells in our brain, and all the electrical, you know, the electrical signals that are going on in our brain, that somehow all of that gives rise to our experience of consciousness, like our experience of an apple. Okay, and in Buddhism, they actually say that that isn't possible because the brain is something that is physical. The brain came from our parents, it came from, you know, the food that we ate, it came from all the physical causes and conditions. And you can't have a physical cause be the cause for something that is non-physical, because they are two different things. Okay, so what they say is that consciousness existed before our brains came into being, but then when our brains started to come into being, consciousness became interdependent with the brain. Okay, so that means that once the brain dies at death, that consciousness continues, that the mind continues after death. So it existed before this life and it will exist afterwards. And that's this sense of a beginningless continuum. Okay, and then the third point, this thinking without a thinker, is talking about the fact that like a big city, if you imagine a big city, let's say Delhi, for example, if you're familiar, any big city, I mean, it can be New York, Sydney, any of those, Paris, France, all those. These cities operate and they function with all their different parts operating as a city, as a whole, without any single being or even agency that directs every single one of them. Okay, so we could talk about a government, but a government doesn't control crime. You know, a government doesn't control everything. I mean, now maybe they're trying with the police and stuff to keep everybody in their house, but in fact, we're complying because we're choosing to comply. If everybody decided to come out of their house, then the government probably couldn't keep us in. But we're all complying. So the brain, in many ways, is like that. For a long time, when they were researching the brain, they were trying to find, like, specifically which organ of the brain directed all the other organs of the brain, and they could never actually find a single organ that was responsible for all the different functions of the brain. You can have the more unconscious functions of the brain, like the cerebellum, which is what they call the hindbrain, or and it can be functioning to be, you know, keeping your breathing going when you're doing all this problem solving up here, right? And so they're all functioning independently. So this is when we talk about thinking without a thinker. And the mind is like this too. We can have feelings at one point, and we can have discrimination at another point, and we can have each of these functions operating in the mind without having to have a self or an I or a single concrete thing that is directing each part of our mind. These parts of our mind, although they interact together interdependently, there's no one thing that is saying, okay, now you think about this, and now you feel this way, and now you do this. It just doesn't exist. But they do function as a whole. They still are all a part of you. Yeah, okay, that's enough. Okay, so that's some ideas about the mind. So this is what it is that we're working with. When we start talking about meditation, in order to make the mind more flexible, in order to start to challenge some of these habits, some of these causes of suffering that we have, we're gonna do this. The path is working with the mind, making it more flexible. So we have to know what it is that we're working with. Okay, so we have to know a little bit. And also, I think it really helps to have some idea of that the mind, I think we talked about this a little bit yesterday too. We have an ability to change our minds in the moment very easily, but they also have these really powerful habits, ways of thinking that are kind of stuck in our minds. And that's the ignorance that we talked about, this misperception of reality, this misperception of ourselves, this misperception of how the world exists. That actually is a very strong habit. And even if you learn about it intellectually, it isn't necessarily going to change your way of interacting with the world until you start to do some really powerful meditation on it, on these topics. And tomorrow we're going to talk more about the meditation. Okay, so maybe, one more topic. Okay, let's go to this. Okay, so this idea of our Buddha potential. So yesterday when I talked about the life of the Buddha, I talked about the fact that the Buddha said that he was not unique in terms of being able to become awakened, in being able to become enlightened. And actually, all of our minds, in their essence, are the same as the mind of a Buddha, in the sense that all of our Buddha's mind has this clear and knowing nature, and so does our mind. The problem, that the difference between ordinary beings and the Buddha is one problem is this ignorance, this misperception of reality, that we see things in a way that they aren't necessarily, in the way that they don't necessarily exist. And as a result, we generate negativities in our mind that are not essentially part of it. Okay, so like, let's say, for example, we have a lot of anger. Okay, so we often, get triggered really easily, and we end up, yelling at people and, harming people. And the negativity, the anger that is in our mind is not essentially part of it, in the sense that it can be removed. So if you've ever worked hard, like if you've ever struggled with difficult emotions, like say, depression or anger or jealousy, and if you've ever been able to actually stop them, to reduce them, then that they aren't, if they were essentially part of the mind, then they would always exist. Your mind would always have this same level of anger or same level of jealousy. And we know that isn't the case, that we have, an ability to change the habits of our mind. And then the last one is that each of us has a basic goodness which can be developed limitlessly. And this has to do with the fact that our the way we exist as interdependent beings, that we do not exist alone, is the basis of our connection with others. And that connection is easily grown into an appreciation, a love, a gratitude, a compassion for others, because of that connection. Because we have that connection with others, that means that actually we can grow that limitlessly. So negative emotions like jealousy and anger and pride are actually based on a disconnect. They're based on a belief that we are somehow separate from all other beings. And that isn't actually how we exist. When you start looking at it more closely, you cannot exist without others. It is completely impossible. And we see this now with this pandemic. The fact that this disease, that started in China and has spread globally, is just such a clear example of our interdependent nature. And now we're having to separate ourselves from others, and yet at the same time there's this powerful, overwhelming sense of connection with the whole world, because everybody is experiencing this. Every country has this disease now. It's a very interesting and powerful situation that we're in, and really something we can really use for ourselves. Okay, to learn, to grow, to train. Okay, if you have some questions, you can type them in the chat, and then Felipe will call on you and we can do a little bit of talking.
Thank you, Venerable. I am going to unmute Vivan. I'm not going to try to pronounce your last name because I'll butcher it, but please ask your question now out loud.
Hello, thank you for your course, it's very interesting. I would like to understand more what is the mind. You said it's like awareness or consciousness, but how can you define it? Is it like the soul? If it's not the brain, how can you explain more?
Yeah, so this idea of a soul, it comes from a theistic context, right? Which really doesn't apply here. So we can't say that it is a soul in the exact same way as it would be defined by someone who is Christian or Muslim or Jewish. I don't know about Jewish, sorry, if they have souls, but anyway, I think they do. But if you talk about the fact that mind is beginningless and therefore also endless, we could say that a soul exists that way as well, right? Some ideas of a soul are also eternal, beginningless and endless. But when we start to talk about the relationship of the soul to the mind, that's when we start to get a little fuzzy. That they may not be the exact same thing, okay? So in the sense that many definitions of soul have a belief that it is unchanging, and yet we see with the mind that it is constantly changing. So there are similarities, but there are also differences. So you probably couldn't equate it with with a uh, with a Christian sense of soul or a Muslim sense of soul, I don't think. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Sure.
Can I ask also another question?
Sure.
When it's not physical, can you, if we want to visualize the mind, do we have to visualize here in the head? I mean, like around here?
Yeah, no, actually it's hard to do when, you know, I think the way we start when we're working with the mind and starting to observe it is that we observe the thoughts. And it's actually better not to think that they're in this small part of the head, that actually that they're all around us. You know, I think that's a little easier to start, because then they are not confined and you can start to get a sense of the mind as being more expansive and more wide. So yeah, and that's why we often, when we're meditating on the mind, we actually keep our eyes open, okay? Because then we don't get this sense of all my thoughts are in my head. And there's new research out. I haven't seen it yet, but traditionally in Tibet, that when they point to the mind, they point to their hearts. They don't even see it as in their heads. They see it as in their heart. And there's research more and more that there's a lot of wisdom that comes from the heart. So yeah. But at this brain and mind thing too, sure. One more piece is that, you know, the body can affect the mind. You know, when we take certain drugs, we can induce states like hallucinations, or even if we have a hallucination and we want to not hallucinate, like if there's, you know, psychiatric diseases involved like schizophrenia, we can do things like take drugs in the body to decrease the hallucinations. And the mind can also affect the body in the sense that through the research that they're doing more and more, by practicing meditation, people will have lower blood pressure and increased immune system. So that's also, they have this strong interaction, the two of them. Okay. Next question.
Okay, I'm going to unmute Rike or Reich. I don't know how to pronounce your name. Sorry. You can ask your question now out loud.
Yes. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. My question is, I'm currently going through a breakup and I find it very difficult to let go and to accept the situation as it is and not get swept away by too many negative feelings. So I wanted to ask if there's any way to learn how to better cope with situations that I can't change.
Yeah, so tomorrow when we talk about meditation, your first line of working with difficult emotions that feel very overpowering is through staying with them, becoming fully aware of them. And one way in which we can do this without getting too lost in the thinking about them, because the thinking can become really obsessive, excuse me, we can start thinking the same things over and over and over again, is to let go a little bit of that content and focus on the physical, the feelings, you know, like what is actually happening in the body, you know. So if the heart is hurting, if the stomach is tight, and those, so taking it, being fully present with it, but taking it away from whatever narrative and story the mind is doing with it. Okay, and focusing only on what is happening more on a physical level. And that will allow actually the feelings to be more released, and you to relax more. And then you later, when that's settled down a bit, you can go to more of an analysis of, you know, what happened and what's going on and how do you need to solve the problem. But first, being present with the emotion can help it release. But when we stay in our heads over and over and over, we're just perpetuating the same feelings with our thoughts. We're just, you know, keeping them alive. And if we can let the thoughts go and be present with the physical sensations, that allows it to release more easily. Okay. There's also a really good book about this if you're interested. It's called Emotional Alchemy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's by Tara Bennett Goldman.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Let's see. Oh, I can't. Yeah, maybe you can write that. I can't write that because I can't do a chat.
Yeah, can you repeat the name so I can write it
So
out?
it's Emotional Alchemy.
Alchemy, okay.
Alchemy. Yeah,
Bye.
and her name, Tara is her first name.
Mm-hmm.
And then Bennett, Bennet, and then her second last name is Goldman, the same as the other author. I think it's his wife, Daniel
Got
Goldman.
it.
Goleman.
It's in the chat now.
Okay, great. Thank you. It's a really good one for dealing with difficult emotions. Another question?
Thank you very much.
Sure, you're welcome.
Yes, next I'm going to unmute Sarah Schaffer, and you can now ask your question out loud.
Hi, I was wondering if I heard that you can't really say we're all one, but then we're talking about selflessness and interconnectedness, and I wanted to know what the difference is between the notion of we're all one.
Okay. So it's in this system of Buddhism, we talk about different levels of analysis or not analyzing. So from one perspective, we're separate, aren't we? We're all different people. We're all unique. Okay. And then on another level, we're all interconnected, that we come from, I mean, you can look at this in different ways. If you imagine the fact that we all are the result of all the elements that first appeared in the Big Bang, you could say that we are all connected in that sense of we're all made of the same physical elements. We can talk about interconnectedness in the sense of the fact that we don't exist separately, because we wouldn't be able to be here if we didn't have all the supports from all the people that contributed to our being present now, like the doctors when we were sick. And then we can start talking about the parents of the doctors and their parents and their parents. And we can, you know, make that interconnectedness more and more broad. So on that level, you could say that we are all one in that sense. But that's when we start looking under analysis. Okay. So it's like from two different perspectives. And the reality of it then is somewhere in between those two, isn't it? But it's beyond language. We can't really describe what is between us all being the same and all being different, because our language is based on duality, and the experience is actually based on non-duality. So then I can only talk about it, but I can't actually, it's something you get to experience.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure. Another one? I think, yeah, we can do another one. Maybe two.
Okay, then let me unmute. Unmute, 1 second. Chuk, you can ask your question now out loud. Chuk, are you there?
There he is.
Sorry, Andrew, we can't hear you.
Yeah, I can't hear.
I can read the question if you want, Venerable Drolma.
Yeah, let's do that.
1 second, let me get to it. Where is it?
And Chuk, we're gonna read your question because we can't hear your audio.
It says people who have mental illnesses like dementia or Alzheimer, bipolar, what about their consciousness?
Yeah, that's a really tough question. And I haven't actually asked a lama about this. I've only thought about it a little bit, because I think that because the mind has so many layers and is such a huge thing that we can't necessarily say that the mind that is expressing itself now, like say in an Alzheimer's patient, is necessarily the whole mind. Yeah, it's definitely not the whole mind. It's unfortunately, because of the disease in the brain, the mind doesn't necessarily express itself as clearly as it could. It gets in, this brain disease gets in the way of the ways in which the mind could be more, better functioning or be more accessible. It's very interesting because those beings who have really powerful meditation, like they're starting to do these studies on these Olympic level meditators who have meditated like 50,000 hours in their lifetime, and that what their brains look like, their brains are incredibly healthy and incredibly developed, and but unfortunate, and so then they have more access to the capacity of their minds because of that. And so when brains start to get sick, unfortunately it really limits their capacity, but it doesn't mean that their minds are no, don't still have that Buddha potential and don't still have that that ability to express themselves eventually when they get a new brain, or eventually without a brain. Okay.
And to did a follow-up on the question. So that would mean that is it possible for them to achieve awakening?
Not necessarily in this lifetime, we would say no. They have the potential still, but if they don't have the capacity, no, they can. It doesn't mean that they can't move toward it, but that's true for most of us. Most of us are not going to achieve enlightenment even with healthy brains in this lifetime, but it doesn't mean that we can't develop our minds at the same time, learning, becoming kind, becoming more wise. But for them, the learning is just a little bit slower. It's just not as quick, unfortunately, depending on the danger.
You want to do one more?
Yeah, one more, and then we'll stop.
Okay, so I'm going to unmute Katrin. I hope I pronounced it right. Katrin, you can now ask your question out loud.
Hi, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, you said that consciousness is no beginning and no end, and still you said that it came into being. Did you mean that it was somehow perceived by our mind? But you also said that awareness, mind, and consciousness is the same. And if our mind is the reflecting medium of consciousness awareness, how can mind be the same thing when the mind will at some point die and like deteriorate?
Right. Well, I didn't say that the mind died and deteriorate. I said that the brain died and deteriorated. And
Okay.
the mind doesn't come into being. The brain does, and then the mind can express itself in this being.
Okay.
Okay. So yeah, maybe brain and mind got mixed up there.
Okay, sorry.
No. What's a good book about this one? You know, in the downloads, the text for downloads, there's a good introduction to the mind in there, but it's not very. It's what's a good book about the nature? Yeah, I'll have to think about that one. Maybe I can come up with a book about the mind from a Buddhist perspective. Yeah, I'll look it up. There's in Discovering Buddhism, I'm sure there's good references about the mind. There's the first module is called Mind and Its Potential. And I'll look that up. Okay, so let's do some meditation.
Okay, I'm gonna switch to my video. Okay. Well, hopefully, well, we apologize once again to all of you because the connection today is a bit unstable. But as we've told you before, at least the recording will be there for you to watch later if you want to go back to it. And also, please, when you access the Google Drive folder, actually, it's better to download the recording rather than to just play it from the Google Drive, because then it gets overloaded and then some people won't be able to see it at all. So it's better to just download it onto your own device. All right. So let's go back into a comfortable posture. Let's let the body relax and settle down. Going back to a position where your back can be loosely straight and you can let your body relax and be grounded and stable. And so begin by bringing the awareness into the body with the prompt of the sound of the bell. Landing in the space of physical sensations, allowing the awareness to become grounded and stable. And then expand the awareness to actually cover the entire space of the body. Becoming conscious of your body as a whole. Noticing any physical sensations that arise. Whatever you feel in this physical realm, simply observe it. Take a moment to connect with your body, to experience it without judging or labeling, to simply feel the sensations in your body. Now, in order to settle down, to allow the body to relax, you can give yourself the luxury of 3 deep breaths, filling the lungs to their full capacity with the in-breath, and gently releasing the breath as it goes out, naturally, unimpeded. Breathing in peace and calmness, breathing out worries and concerns. And from that state of calmness and relaxation, simply observe the movement of the breath in the area of the abdomen. How every time you breathe in and breathe out, the belly expands and contracts. So just pay attention to the physical sensations that arise as this movement occurs. By doing this, we synchronize body and mind in this state of calmness and relaxation, cultivating serenity, creating a good basis and a good foundation for the meditation. Now slowly and gently we let go of observing the breath and observing the body. We let go of the realm of the physical and we move on to the space of the mind where thoughts, mental images arise. So take a moment to become aware of your current state of mind. Whatever feelings, emotions, or thoughts are present within your mind right now, take a moment to observe them, to simply become aware of them without judging or engaging with them too much. And now you can start to go back in your day and to recall different experiences that happened today. For some of you, it might be early in the morning. For some of us, it's already the evening. But regardless of that, try to track back on your activities, on the experiences that you had today. And as you do this, as you recall certain things, analyze them, investigate them, and try to get a sense if these experiences are part of the same continuum of mind as your current experience. Check if there's a connection, a thread. And keep going back even until the moment that you woke up this morning. Before that, perhaps you were asleep. And maybe you can even remember some of the dreams you had last night. Again, simply try to recall these experiences, always checking if they are part of the same continuum of mind, the same mind stream. And from there, keep going back in time. Day before, going back and back for days, perhaps even weeks and months, trying to recall your conscious experiences and analyzing whether or not they form part of the same continuum. You can even go back years to the time of your adolescence, to your childhood. But remember that the point of this meditation is not to relive good memories or to deal with difficult situations from the past, rather simply to observe whatever experiences you can recall and to investigate them, to get a sense of the continuity of the mind, how one moment gives rise to the next, how our experiences from the past give rise to our present experience. So keep going back as much as you can. And if there's things that you can't remember, that's normal, that's perfectly okay. Those things are also connected to the same mind stream. The things you can't remember then gave rise to other things that you can. Going back all the way even to when you were a small child. Perhaps, if you can, even recall the moment of your birth. Even get a glimpse of the moment of conception. What do you think happened at that point? Where did the mind of this life come from? Did it come from your parents? But how would that work? Perhaps your mind just came out of nowhere. But is that even possible? No causes, no conditions. Something just popping into existence. Now bring your mind back to the present moment. Once again, become aware of your current state of mind, whatever feelings, emotions, or thoughts are present. And observing them for a minute, try to notice if these feelings, these thoughts, these emotions are actually changing, or if they stay absolutely the same. Try to see if you can catch how one moment of mind gives rise to the next. And that the mind is in motion, just like a stream flowing. Then try to project your mind into the future, thinking how the current experience that you have will give rise to another one. You will continue to experience feelings and emotions and thoughts tomorrow and the day after. Your mind will continue to change and to give rise to new experiences. As time goes by, as we grow old, we experience different things. And then we reach a point where the mind of this life comes to the point of death. And up to that moment, the mind has always given rise to its result, another moment of mind. So what do you think happens at the point of death? Will the mind then become something else? Will it disappear and turn into nothing? Or perhaps, as it has so far, it will simply continue to give rise to its effect, another moment of mind. Why would that point be any different? Now try to get this feeling and experience of your mind as an entity which is flowing, as a continuum, a stream of consciousness that moves in time. One moment giving rise to the next, just like a river that flows. All your experiences as a continuation. Try to get a sense of the continuum of your own mind, a sequence. And simply stay with that experience without analyzing it. But simply letting go of the doing activity of the mind. Just be with the mind as it is. Slowly and gently coming out of the meditation, becoming aware once again of your surroundings and your own body. Now to conclude the session, we will go into the aspect of dedication. I will post in the chat one file with the dedication prayer that we'll do. It's a dedication prayer from the 8th century Master Shantideva, and it's a very beautiful prayer which His Holiness the Dalai Lama often refers to. Let me paste it in the chat so that everyone can see and follow. Oh, sorry, one more time. Here we go. That's one part. And here's another. Okay. So I'll read from it anyway. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain a notion of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled, with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored and find in repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness, and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be free from their ailments. Whatever diseases are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain, to dispel the miseries of the world. May it be so. Okay. You're unmuted, Venerable Drolma.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And we'll see you tomorrow. Come back.
Thank you
Bye.
all so much. And please, to all of you, please be patient with the recordings as well, because it takes a little bit of time to process the recording, the video, and to upload it. So it won't be available immediately, but rather it will take some time to get it uploaded. But it will be certainly there by tomorrow. Thank you very much, everyone. See you soon.